Hi, this is Congressman Tom Cole. This is another one of our Congressional Weekly Chats. But before we talk about what's happening in Congress, let's talk about something terrible that's happened to our fellow Oklahomans right at home, and particularly in the 4th District. Those of you watching this undoubtedly know Oklahoma was hit by a series of tornadoes on Wednesday night, and they had some devastating impacts. Particularly in small towns, particularly in McLean County, in my district, the town of Cole, and just so you know, there's actually no family connection whatsoever. People have asked me that a lot. But we're all connected to people that suffer tragedy. And this is a small community of 100, 3 deaths, enormous amount of damage. We've had damage elsewhere in our district too, Goldsby and Dibble. We've had damage in Shawnee that's not in my district but close by, and we just all grieve for people that have been hurt in these situations, property that's been lost, lives that have been disrupted. As normal, the first responders in Oklahoma do this better than anybody in the country, so the response has been great. As typical of Oklahoma, the neighbor-to-neighbor support has been tremendous. Very pleased the governor has been through a number of these communities right away, and certainly including Cole, and we're very appreciative of Governor Stitt for reaching out and doing that. State emergency management people who we've been in touch with done a great job. FEMA's on the ground. If you have any problems and you've been impacted by these terrible weather events, please feel free to contact our office. We're more than happy to help in any way we can. And if you're some of the fortunate people, many of the fortunate people have not been hurt, I hope you'll, number one, keep our friends and neighbors in your prayers. Hope you'll reach out and help. Many of these communities are running local charities. There's always, of course, entities like the Oklahoma Red Cross, but see what you can do to help those in misfortune. As many of you know, I live in Moore, Oklahoma. I think we're tornado central. In a tornado-driven state. Moore is the only town in the world that's been hit by 2 F5s, and in my first 12 years or so in Congress, we were hit by 6 or 7 different tornadoes. We've been spared in recent years, but a lot of our friends and neighbors haven't been, and certainly, we saw damage in Norman earlier this spring. Now we've had this event, and you're never out of the danger in Oklahoma. But we're in the period of peak danger right now in April, May, and early June. So again, keep your fellow Oklahomans in your thoughts and prayers. Do what you can to help. And I, for one, am just grateful to all those who are stepping forward to help the families that have lost people and certainly their homes and have had their lives disrupted. Oklahomans always rally together, and I know they will again this time. But I wanted to begin by acknowledging that very sad fact in our state. Congress has had a busy week, and the House has moved a couple of significant pieces of legislation. One is culturally controversial for some people, and that's legislation to basically say that women's sports is women and girls, and men and boys are men and boys, and we're not going to blur that division, and Title IX funding can be impacted to people that try and do it. To me, this is a fundamental issue of fairness. I have concern when I'm not interested in discriminating against anybody, but biological girls and women should not have to compete against biological boys and males who have an advantage. And so we can figure this out and work it through, but I think protecting the integrity of women's athletics, and we're a state where we've seen some extraordinary achievements. I'm so proud of the OU women's gymnastic team. It's won 6 of the last 9 national championships, including the last 2 in a row. They just won one. Very proud of the University of Oklahoma women's softball team. That's won 5 of the last 9 national championships, including 2 in a row, and is ranked #1 right now in the country. And so I'm not interested in discriminating or exploiting against anybody, but I do want to protect the integrity of the process, and I think that was the appropriate way to do so. But again, we'll continue to discuss this and work on it undoubtedly going forward. There's also an issue, Congress has a unique responsibility where Washington, D.C. is concerned. And while we've given Washington, D.C. a considerable measure of home rule and very, very seldom interfere in its internal affairs, the reality is this is the capital city of the United States of America. And the Constitution makes it very clear that Congress has the ultimate authority in determining what laws will prevail within this area. We've seen the D.C. Council, which is a very liberal council, do some extraordinarily dangerous things. A new criminal code, for instance, a few weeks ago, that would have lowered penalties and made it easier for those who committed them to stay on the streets. Congress acted, but it did so only after the mayor of D.C. had actually vetoed the legislation. She was overridden by what I would consider a radical city council. Congress pointed this out. My colleague Andrew Clyde from Georgia raised the issue and said we should disapprove this. His bill passed with bipartisan support on the floor. It passed in the United States Senate with bipartisan support. It went to the president's desk, and the president, who had earlier opposed the measure, signed it. This is a similar situation. This is a set of regulations that would inhibit the police force in the District of Columbia. It's opposed by the police force in the District of Columbia, also various national law enforcement organizations have also opposed it. And simply, look, we don't need to hinder the police in a period where we have skyrocketing crime, which we certainly do in Washington, D.C., and where we're short of officers by about 1,200. So we want to do things that work with the police, and this is an effort by disapproving the action of the city council to limit their ability to police D.C. will I think ultimately be to the advantage of law enforcement. Now, whether this will pass the Senate, I don't know. I suspect it may. Whether the president, who currently opposes it, will actually change his view and sign it is very unclear to me. That's what he did on the previous measure. But anyway, two pretty significant areas. Third area of activity is appropriations in my particular subcommittee, which is Transportation, Housing, and Urban Development. We heard from both cabinet secretaries this week advancing the president's budget. That'd be Secretary Fudge, who's actually an old colleague of mine. She's a member of the House of Representatives, very well thought of, very highly regarded. And Secretary Pete Buttigieg, who's Secretary of Transportation, recently visited Oklahoma, went to the Mike Monroney Aeronautical Center and to the Oklahoma City Airport and a tour of regional airports to talk about their needs. So we'll agree on some things, we'll disagree on others, but I was happy to see the hearings, and we'll be marking up bills in this area in the not too distant future. So hearing their point of view as the people responsible for administering their agencies was helpful. And as is normally the case, we'll find some areas we're going to work together. We're going to find some other areas where we're going to disagree, but we're going to try and work them out and come to common ground. By far the most consequential action of the week was by Speaker McCarthy. You've been hearing about this debt ceiling issue for some time. That is, the United States, if the debt ceiling isn't raised, runs out of the ability to increase the amount of money it can borrow. That sounds like a good thing, but it also means that when you hit the ceiling, you start defaulting on obligations you've already undertaken. That's never good. We're not interested in jeopardizing the full faith and credit of the United States. Speaker has made that crystal clear, but he has said if we're going to raise the debt ceiling, we expect to do some common sense things to change our pattern of spending and to make our economy more productive. Some of these things are just simply what you would expect. We're going to spend less money. Republicans have already basically acted as the brakes on the car and said we're not going to do another $1.9 trillion American Rescue Plan. We're not going to do another $750 billion Inflation Reduction Act. So the outside spending, and we're going to look at what we do every day and do two things. One, we're going to scrutinize it. Is it something we really need, or is it something we can do without? And we're going to reprioritize it. That is, we're going to put more money behind defense. It's a very dangerous world. We're going to put more money on the southern border where the president's policies have led to chaos. And we're certainly going to make sure our veterans are taken care of. But beyond those three priorities, other things are on the table to be looked at, not because we want to do it, but because I think getting the budget under control is important. It's important to the long-term financial health of the country. It's also important in reducing inflation. Most economists agree that the explosion of spending once the Democrats got the House, the Senate, and the presidency is what was responsible for the worst outbreak of inflation in over 40 years. That inflation makes life tougher on every single family, particularly families in lower income measures. And it's the inflation that's enforced the Federal Reserve to actually raise interest rates, and that increases the prices of home for first-time home buyers, the prices of a car for people looking for a new automobile, the prices of washers and dryers and televisions for people that are forced to buy money or borrow money, do it. So again, we're going to do what we can to make sure that we spend less so inflation subsides. And so the Speaker put a proposal forward and said, okay, we will raise the debt ceiling by a specific amount of money, which would take us well into next year before we had to deal with this issue again. And we're going to do some things to cut our spending. Now, we're also going to do some things to increase our growth. That is, do some things like streamlining and modernizing the permitting process so we can bring more oil and gas and pipelines online. We're going to do some things like require people who are getting benefits from the federal government who are single and ages 18 to 49. If you're going to get welfare, you're going to have to work. We expect you to spend look for jobs, get at least 20 hours a week of work in. We want to move you into the workforce. We think that's good long-term for our society. Then everybody's contributing to Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, the defense of the country, and what have you. It's also good for those individuals. I promise you, nobody gets rich collecting a government check. Makes a lot more sense to get you into the workforce. Longer term, that's better for your family, better for you, certainly better for society. So those are some of the things we put on the table, and basically told the president and the Democrats, we're going to pass this bill next week. It will raise the debt ceiling to protect the credit of the United States, and here are our ideas about the changes that we need to make in terms of our spending and in terms of our investment strategy. We don't expect Democrats to agree with all those ideas, but what they're going to have to do is in a Democratic Senate pass their own version of what they think the right thing to do is. And the president's going to have to sit down and negotiate with the Speaker and the various sides in the Senate and the House and come together. One of the most outrageous things about this whole debt ceiling debate is that the president met with Speaker McCarthy 45 days ago to start a negotiation. And the president said, we'll start meeting and meet frequently. There hasn't been any meetings since then. Instead, we've had the president and his Democratic colleagues demand, hey, you have to raise the debt ceiling before we even talk to you. That's crazy. And frankly, it won't pass the Republican House. So we're going to pass our bill, and then we intend to wait and see what they can do or will do on their side of the aisle. Sit down and negotiate. But they should know the door is open. We want to talk. We want to find some reforms we can both agree on that will both reduce spending and spur productivity in our economy. And I applaud Speaker McCarthy for actually, doing putting a real proposal on the table and inviting the president to do the same, and the Democrats in the Senate. Now we'll see whether or not they actually have any ideas themselves other than to spend us right into bankruptcy and to stimulate inflation by unchecked spending. They did it for the first 2 years, have a Republican House now. That's not going to happen for the next 2. Let me end with this. Again, my thoughts and prayers, and I know everybody who's listening to this, thoughts and prayers are with the people who suffered losses in the recent tornadoes. Do what you can to help, and certainly pray if you're so inclined. I think that makes a real difference. I look forward to talking to you next week. It will be a very consequential week in terms of this debt ceiling issue and in terms of moving appropriations and funding the government adequately going forward. And as always, thanks to all of you, and the office is here to help, particularly to those of you who've suffered damages and losses in this recent batch of terrible weather. Don't hesitate to reach out to us. Believe me, we're going to spend our time reaching out to you. Good luck. God bless. Talk to you next week.